There is a question that has drifted through the minds of historians, sailors and dreamers for more than 5 centuries. A question that carries within it the whole weight of the age of exploration. The smell of spice and salt water, the creak of wooden hulls against Atlantic swells, and the ambition of 2 small kingdoms perched on the edge of a continent, staring out at a world that no European had ever mapped. The question is this: who ruled the oceans first? Was it Portugal, the tiny nation at the southwestern tip of Europe, whose navigators spent nearly a century creeping their way down the African coast, learning the winds, learning the currents, building the ships, solving the mathematical puzzles of celestial navigation, one painstaking degree at a time, until at last they swung around the bottom of Africa and arrived, stunned and triumphant, in the harbours of India? Or was it Spain, the newly united kingdom that gambled on a strange Genoese sailor with a dream of finding Asia, by sailing west, who stumbled instead upon 2 enormous continents that no European had ever imagined, and who then poured soldiers, priests, administrators, and silver ships through that discovery until half the world spoke Spanish and the other half owed it money? The answer, as with so many things in history, is more interesting than a simple declaration of a winner. Both nations ruled the oceans, each in its own way, each in its own direction, and together they remade the planet so completely that we are still living inside the world they built. The borders of modern nations, the languages spoken across continents, the religions practiced by billions, the crops that feed the world, the silver that created the first global economy. All of it flows back to a period of roughly 100 years, between roughly 1415 and 1522, when Portugal and Spain pointed their ships into the unknown and did not look back. Tonight, that is the story we are going to tell. It is a long one, intentionally, deliberately long, because this is a story built for the hours when the day has let go of you and the night is offering its particular kind of quiet. These are the best hours for history, because history told in the dark in the listening mode sinks differently than history read from a page in the glare of afternoon. It settles somewhere deeper. You remember it not just as information but as texture, as the felt sense of other lives and other times, of worlds that were once as vivid and immediate as your own. And this story has a great deal of texture. It is full of characters who are brilliant and brutal, visionary and violent, driven by faith and greed and curiosity in equal measure. There are storms that swallowed fleets, negotiations that carved up the entire globe with a single line drawn through the Atlantic, warriors who conquered empires with handfuls of men, and sailors who died of scurvy in mid-ocean, never knowing that what they were suffering for would become the foundation of the modern world. There are kings and admirals whose names you may know, and there are ordinary sailors and enslaved people and indigenous farmers whose names are gone, but whose lives were caught up in the same enormous turning of history and shaped it as surely as any king. Let us begin at the beginning. Not with the ships, not yet. Let us begin with the world before the ships, because that world, and its hungers, its fears, and its peculiar geography, is what made everything that followed not merely possible, but inevitable. To understand why Portugal and Spain turned to the sea in the 15th century, you have to understand just how uncomfortable the world had become for European merchants and rulers in the decades before. The discomfort was not new. It had been building for centuries, but in the middle of the 1400s it reached a kind of crisis point, a moment when the old arrangements simply stopped working and something new had to be found. Europe had been connected to the luxuries of Asia for a very long time. The Silk Road, that vast overland network of routes and relay stations stretching from China through Central Asia and Persia and into the Mediterranean, had been moving goods westward for more than 1,000 years. Silk, obviously, but also porcelain and jade, paper and gunpowder, and above all spice. Pepper and cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg, cardamom and ginger. Spice was not a minor luxury in medieval Europe. It was a currency, a medicine, a preservative, a symbol of status, and perhaps most importantly a way of making the monotonous and often borderline spoiled food of Northern Europe taste like something worth eating. A man who could put pepper on his table was a man of consequence. A merchant who could supply it reliably was very, very wealthy. The problem was the middlemen. The Silk Road was not a single route under any single control. It passed through dozens of kingdoms, sultanates, and city-states, each of which extracted its toll. By the time pepper arrived in Venice, and Venice for a long time was the gateway through which most Asian goods entered Europe. It had been handled by Persian merchants, Arab traders, Egyptian customs officials and Venetian brokers, each adding their markup until the price bore no rational relationship to the cost of growing the pepper in the first place. Contemporaries estimated that spice arriving in Europe cost 10 to 30 times what it had cost at the source. The money bled out of Europe at every link in the chain, and then, in 1453, the chain snapped. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who was 21 years old and who had studied military history with the focused intensity of a man who intended to remake it, pointed his army at Constantinople. The city had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years, a Christian fortress at the crossing between Europe and Asia, the last remnant of the Roman Empire's eastern half. It fell on the 29th of May after a siege of 53 days, when Ottoman cannon breached walls that had held against every previous attacker for 11 centuries. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died in the final defence, his body never definitively identified among the fallen. The cannon that breached the walls of Constantinople were themselves a product of the very cultural exchange that the Ottoman conquest disrupted. A Hungarian engineer named Orban had originally offered his cannon casting services to the Byzantine emperor, who could not afford him, and had then sold those services to Mehmed, who could. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The walls that had protected Christendom for a millennium fell partly to a Christian engineer's technology, funded by the wealth of the Islamic world. History rarely has the decency to cast itself in simple moral terms. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, the already difficult trade routes to Asia became actively hostile. The Ottomans were not uninterested in trade. They understood its value and eventually organised it themselves with considerable sophistication, but in the short term and the medium term, the old European arrangements were disrupted, the costs of access rose, and the uncertainty was profound. European merchants and monarchs began, with varying degrees of urgency, to ask the same question: was there another way? There were, in fact, two ideas about how to find that other way. The first was to go around Africa. This required accepting that Africa was a continent you could circumnavigate, which was not a settled question in the early 15th century. Ancient Greek geographers had theorized that the world was round and that Africa must have an end somewhere to the south, but the practical reality was that no one had been there. Arab sailors had ventured down the East African coast for centuries, reaching as far as Mozambique and Madagascar, but they had not told Europeans about it, and European knowledge of the African continent south of the Sahara was essentially mythological. There were stories of deserts that never ended, of seas that boiled, of magnetic rocks that pulled the nails from ships, of monsters. The practical case for trying to go around Africa was strong. The psychological barrier was enormous. The second idea was even more radical: go west. Sail into the Atlantic Ocean, that vast and poorly understood expanse that the ancient Greeks had called the Sea of Darkness, and keep going until you hit Asia from the other side. This idea required accepting that the world was round, which educated Europeans in the 15th century generally did accept, flat Earth being more a later myth about medieval ignorance than an actual medieval belief. But it also required having some idea of how big the world was. And here the theory had a problem. The world was, in fact, much bigger than most 15th century estimates allowed. Going west to Asia was theoretically possible, but it was going to take much longer than anyone thought, and in the meantime, you would run out of food and water and die in the ocean. This was the genuine, rational objection to the westward route, and it turned out to be correct in every respect except for the crucial one: there was something in the way. But these ideas were still forming, still circulating in the courts and counting houses and navigation schools of the Iberian Peninsula, in the years when Portugal took its first decisive steps toward oceanic empire. And those steps began not in the Atlantic, not with spice routes or the dream of Asia, but with a war, a city, and a prince who was transformed by what he saw. The city was Ceuta. It sits on the North African coast at the point where the Mediterranean narrows to meet the Atlantic, a few miles across the water from Gibraltar, and in 1415 it was one of the richest trading cities in the Muslim world, a node in the network, through which gold from sub-Saharan Africa and spice from the east flowed northward into European hands. The Portuguese king João I, saw it as both a military opportunity and a commercial prize, and on August 21st, 1415, his fleet of 200 ships carrying perhaps 45,000 men descended on Ceuta in an assault so overwhelming that the city fell in a single afternoon. It was a stunning military achievement, and the young princes who rode with their father that day, Duarte, Pedro, and the one who would become most famous of all, Enrique, were changed by it. What Enrique, who history knows as Henry the Navigator, found in Ceuta was not just military glory. He found warehouses filled with goods that had no business being there, goods that had travelled impossible distances, gold from places whose names he did not know, spices that should have been unattainable, cloth from India and Persia and China, and the merchants who had moved, all of this, before the Portuguese swords cleared them out, had not come from Europe. They had come from the south, down from the interior of Africa, across routes that no European had ever travelled, through lands that no European mapmaker had ever drawn. Enrique stood in those warehouses and understood with the particular clarity of a young man who has just won his first battle that there was a world to the south that Europe did not know, and he decided, then or shortly after, that he was going to find it. Henry the Navigator is one of those historical figures whose legend has been built up so carefully and so extensively over the centuries that it has almost swallowed the actual man. The legend says he founded a great school of navigation at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where the land juts out into the Atlantic like the prow of a ship, and the wind never seems to stop. In this legend, Henry gathered the greatest cartographers, mathematicians, astronomers, and sailors of the age, set them to work solving the problems of navigation and geography, and sent fleet after fleet down the African coast with a relentless and methodical purpose, as though the whole project of oceanic exploration was his personal program, executed according to a rational plan. The reality is somewhat more complicated and, in its own way, considerably more interesting. Henry did establish himself at Sagres, or in the vicinity of it. The exact location of any school or research centre he may have organised is still debated by historians, and some of what was attributed to him in his own lifetime was plainly exaggerated by admirers. But the essential truth of his role is not in question. For more than 4 decades, from the fall of Ceuta in 1415 until his death in 1460, he was the driving force behind Portuguese exploration along the African coast, providing funding, political protection, accumulated knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to keep going when every voyage seemed to confirm that the known world simply ended somewhere around Cape Bojador, on the coast of what is now Western Sahara. Cape Bojador, whose Arabic name means something like bulging cape, was a geographical barrier that was also a psychological one. It is not, in physical terms, a particularly dramatic cape. The headland extends only a little way into the ocean, and the sea there, while rough with shoals and contrary winds and an uncomfortable swell, is not uniquely dangerous by the standards of what Portuguese sailors would eventually encounter further south. But it marked the boundary of the known. Arab geographers called the waters south of it the Green Sea of Darkness. Portuguese sailors who had ventured near it reported strong currents that seemed to flow only southward, with no way back, and winds that made northward sailing next to impossible, though this was partly navigation superstition rather than physical reality. The psychological weight of the Cape was immense. 14 expeditions sent south by Henry, between roughly 1424 and 1432, turned back before it. The man who finally passed it was Gil Eanes, a squire in Henry's household, and his achievement in 1434 was one of those seemingly modest events that carry enormous historical weight. Eanes did not discover a continent or a trade route. He simply sailed around the Cape and returned, but in doing so he proved that the barrier was in the mind, not in the ocean, and everything changed. The following year, Eanes went back with Afonso Baldaya, and this time they sailed 200 miles beyond the Cape, finding not boiling seas or magnetic rocks, but a desert coast, empty and pale under the African sun, and in the sand, footprints, human footprints. Someone lived there. The world did not end at Cape Bojador, it continued. With the barrier broken, the expeditions accelerated. In 1441, Antão Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão reached the Bay of Arguin, deep in the Saharan coast, and returned to Portugal with a cargo that would shape the next 4 centuries of Atlantic history in the most destructive possible way. They brought back a dozen enslaved Africans. Henry, who was a religious man, and who understood enslavement primarily through the lens of Christian theology, where non-Christians could be enslaved as an act of war and potentially saved through conversion, was reportedly pleased. In 1444, the first large-scale slave market was held in Lagos, in southern Portugal, when 240 Africans were divided among their captors. The chronicler Gomes Enes de Zurara recorded the scene with evident discomfort. The wailing, the family separations, the children torn from their parents, the anguish. And then he recorded Henry's justification, that the souls of these people would be saved, and moved on. The traffic in enslaved human beings along the African coast would eventually become the largest forced migration in human history. It began here, in these early Portuguese expeditions, and its shadow falls across everything that follows. Henry himself remains, despite all this, a figure of genuine intellectual fascination. He was deeply religious, a member of the Order of Christ, the Portuguese continuation of the Knights Templar, and he seems to have understood his exploratory project as a religious mission as much as a commercial one. He was obsessed with the legend of Prester John, a mysterious Christian king supposedly ruling a powerful kingdom somewhere in the interior of Africa or Asia, who could, if found, become an ally against the Muslim world that surrounded Christendom on so many sides. Every expedition sent south was also, in Henry's mind, a search for this phantom ally. Prester John was never found. He had been a legend from the beginning, a fiction that geography eventually made impossible to maintain. But the search for him drove Portuguese navigators further and further, into genuinely unknown territory. What Henry actually gathered at Sagres, or in his household, was a remarkable collection of geographical knowledge. Maps came to him from across the Mediterranean world. Catalan and Genoese charts, Arabic geographic texts, accounts from Moroccan and Saharan traders about what lay further south. Jewish cartographers, who occupied a peculiar and skilled position in Iberian intellectual life, contributed their mathematical and astronomical expertise. Sailors who had been to the Canary Islands, to the Azores, to Madeira, islands in the Atlantic that Henry's expeditions also organised and settled, brought practical knowledge of winds and currents that was slowly, painfully, building up into a systematic understanding of Atlantic meteorology. It was not a school in any formal sense. It was a household, a court, a patronage network. But the knowledge it accumulated was real, and it mattered. There is something deeply worth examining in the particular nature of Henry's ambition, because it was not the simple ambition of a conqueror who wanted more territory, nor the simple greed of a merchant who wanted more profit. It was something more composite and, in its own way, more modern, a desire to know, married to a desire to possess, conducted through the instrument of a state that had the will and the resources to sustain it over decades. Henry was, in the language of his own age, a crusader. He understood his project as an extension of the Christian war against Islam that had defined Iberian culture for 7 centuries. But he was also something newer, an empiricist who valued accurate information about the world and who understood, ahead of most of his contemporaries, that knowledge and power were not separate things but the same thing. The men he sent south were not simply brave. They were trained, informed, equipped with the best available charts and instruments, and debriefed carefully on their return. What they found, the shape of the coastline, the depth of the water, the behaviour of the currents and winds, the location of hazards, the nature of the peoples and the animals and the vegetation, was recorded and accumulated and used to plan the next voyage, which could start from a better position than the last. It was, in a meaningful sense, a scientific program, and while it would be anachronistic to call Henry a scientist in the modern sense, the institutional culture he created of systematic observation, recorded knowledge, and progressive improvement was genuinely methodological in a way that distinguished it from the ad hoc bravado of individual adventurers. The men who carried out these voyages deserve more than the passing acknowledgement they often receive. Behind the famous names Diaz da Gama, Columbus, were hundreds of ordinary sailors, pilots, surgeons, caulkers, carpenters, and soldiers who spent months and years of their lives in conditions of physical hardship and genuine mortal danger for wages that were never fully commensurate with the risk. They died of scurvy and dysentery and storms and violence and the nameless fevers that coastal Africa produced with such lethal regularity. They survived by skill and luck, and the particular kind of solidarity that forms among small groups of men who depend completely on one another in a dangerous world. Their individual names are mostly lost. Their collective achievement is the world as we know it. When Henry died in 1460, his expeditions had reached the coast of present-day Sierra Leone, more than 1,500 miles south of Cape Bojador. The forests of West Africa had replaced the Saharan desert. The coast had bent eastward in a way that suggested to those who read it hopefully that the southern end of the continent might be closer than it seemed. The gold trade, actual African gold, traded at coastal forts that Portugal was beginning to establish, had made the whole enterprise commercially viable for the first time. The slave trade was well established and horribly profitable, and a generation of Portuguese sailors had accumulated a body of practical oceanic knowledge, of celestial navigation and wind patterns and current behaviour that their successors would build on to achieve what Henry had imagined but never reached: the voyage around Africa to India. It is worth pausing here to think about what kind of man undertakes something like this. Henry was not a great sailor himself. He made no long voyages. He was an organiser, a patron, a political operator within the Portuguese court, where he had to constantly justify the expense of expeditions that, in the early decades, returned little profit and much hardship. He spent heavily, sometimes to the point where his personal finances were strained, on something that he could not be certain would ever pay back. He was driving toward a destination that no one had confirmed existed in the form he imagined, along a route that no one had ever travelled, using ships and techniques that were still being invented. The patience and persistence of it, sustained over 4 decades, is extraordinary by any standard. Whether he was a hero, a visionary, a slave trader, or all three simultaneously is a question that history does not resolve cleanly, because he was all of those things, and the age that made him possible did not see the contradictions in the same way we do. In the decade after Henry's death, the Portuguese crown took more direct control of the exploration enterprise. The expeditions continued under royal patronage, and the pace quickened. Fernão Gomes, a merchant who in 1469 paid the Portuguese crown for an exclusive license to trade along the African coast, in exchange for agreeing to explore at least 100 leagues of new coastline each year, pushed the boundary of the known world southward with startling speed. By the mid-1470s, Portuguese sailors had crossed the equator. By 1483, Diogo Cao had reached the Congo River, the great waterway that poured into the Atlantic south of the equator, and had planted the first of the stone pillars, the padrões, markers of possession and discovery, that would become signatures of Portuguese expansion. By 1486, Cao had reached as far south as what is now Namibia. The end of Africa, if it had an end, was beginning to feel achievable. And it was in this atmosphere, of acceleration, of accumulating momentum, of a generation that had grown up hearing the stories of what lay to the south and was now determined to find the end of them, that Bartolomeu Dias prepared the expedition that would change everything, not just for Portugal, for the world. Before we follow Dias around the southern tip of Africa, it is worth spending a little time with the ships, because the ships are part of the story in a way that is easy to overlook. The Portuguese achievement in the Age of Discovery was not simply a matter of courage, though it required enormous courage. It was also a matter of technology, and the central technology was the caravel. The caravel was not a large ship by the standards of the later age of sail. A typical caravel of the mid-15th century was perhaps 70 to 90 feet in length, displacing somewhere between 50 and 200 tons, with a crew of 20 to 30 men who lived in conditions that would have struck any modern observer as somewhere between difficult and horrifying. There was no enclosed sleeping space for most of the crew, who slept on deck or wherever they could find room among the ropes and stores. The food, salted fish, dried biscuit, occasionally salted meat, whatever fresh provisions could be picked up at stops along the way, was monotonous and progressively more degraded as a voyage extended. Fresh water was carried in casks that spoiled. Rats were universal. Scurvy, the disease of vitamin C deficiency that caused the skin to ulcerate and the teeth to fall out, and the muscles to waste, was not yet understood as a dietary disease and could not be reliably prevented or treated. On long voyages, men died of it in large numbers. What made the caravel revolutionary was not its size or its crew comfort, but its rigging. Earlier European ships had been primarily square-rigged, carrying large square sails that worked well before the wind but could not sail effectively against it. The caravel, drawing on traditions from both northern European and Mediterranean shipbuilding, and possibly influenced by Arab lateen rigging as well, combined square and lateen sails in configurations that allowed it to sail much closer to the wind. This mattered enormously on the African coast, where the prevailing winds blew from the north and made returning from southward voyages extremely difficult without the ability to tack against them. The caravel could do it. Not easily, not quickly, but it could work its way back upwind in a way that's square-rigged. Ships could not, and this single capability made the whole project of systematic exploration along the African coast possible. You could go south and come back. You could do it again. You could learn. The caravel also had a relatively shallow draft compared to larger trading vessels, which meant it could venture into coastal waters, explore river mouths, and get close enough to shore to observe and make contact without running aground. This flexibility was crucial during the period of coastal exploration, when the primary task was learning the shape of the continent, its capes and bays, its river systems, its shoals, rather than making rapid long-distance passages. Bartolomeo Diaz set out from Lisbon in August of 1487 with a small fleet, 2 caravels and a supply ship. He was an experienced mariner who had previously served on voyages to the Gold Coast, and he carried with him the accumulated knowledge of more than 50 years of Portuguese exploration along the African coast, the charts that had been built up voyage by voyage, the records of winds and currents, the locations of the stone pillars that Diogo Cao had planted. He also carried several Africans who'd been brought to Portugal, educated, dressed in fine clothes, and were now being returned to their home regions as goodwill ambassadors, and, it was hoped, as sources of intelligence about what lay further south. The gesture was well-intentioned by the standards of the age, which is not to say it was not also profoundly patronising and manipulative. History is full of these ambiguous kindnesses. Diaz followed the known coast southward, past the furthest point Cao had reached, into waters where no Portuguese ship had been before. Somewhere off the coast of what is now Namibia, in late December of 1487 or early January of 1488, he encountered the storm that would define his voyage. It is not entirely clear from the historical record how severe this storm was or exactly where it struck, but its effect was dramatic. It blew Diaz's ship southward and then westward, out of sight of the African coast for more than 2 weeks. When the storm abated, Diaz was somewhere in the open Southern Ocean, far south of the continent and blown far out into the Atlantic. He turned east, expecting to find the African coast. He did not find it. He turned north, and eventually land appeared, but it was the southern coast of Africa, facing east and south, not west. He had been pushed past the southern tip of the continent without seeing it. The realization of what this meant must have dawned slowly. Diaz sailed eastward along the southern African coast, finding it curving away to the northeast, the direction of India. He put in at what is now called Mossel Bay, where his crew found fresh water and herds of cattle, and a brief, confused, and eventually violent encounter with the local Khoikhoi people, who retreated into the hills and then came back and threw rocks at the sailors until Diaz, in an incident he clearly regretted given his later behaviour in the same area, fired a crossbow and killed a man. He planted a padrão. He continued eastward, reaching what is now the Algoa Bay area near present-day Port Elizabeth before his crew, cold and frightened and homesick, refused to go further. This was a common pattern in the voyages of the age. The captain's vision and determination almost always outran the crew's willingness to follow, and at some point the balance of authority shifted enough that the voyage had to turn back. Diaz apparently argued with his men for several days, eventually getting them to agree to continue for 3 more days before turning around. They turned around. He had been close enough to the Indian Ocean to understand what he had done, but not close enough to confirm it by reaching waters that were known from Arab or Indian charts. On the return voyage, sailing westward along the southern coast, he saw for the first time the cape he had passed in the storm, a dramatic rocky promontory lashed by wind and surf. He named it Cabo das Tormentas, Cape of Storms. The Portuguese king Juan II, who received the news of the voyage with joy and relief, renamed it. He called it the Cape of Good Hope, Cabo da Boa Esperança, because it offered hope of the route to India. Diaz returned to Lisbon in December of 1488, having been at sea for 16.5 months, one of the longest voyages yet undertaken in the age of exploration. He had not reached India, he had not opened the trade route, but he had proven that Africa had a southern end, and that the ocean beyond it connected to the waters that Arab sailors had been navigating for centuries. Everything after this was, in a sense, a matter of logistics. The significance of what Dias had done took time to fully register, even in a court that had been preparing for this moment for decades. The knowledge that Africa could be rounded was transformative, but it opened as many questions as it answered. How far was India from the Cape? What were the winds like in the southern Indian Ocean, and could they be relied upon to carry a fleet from the Cape to Calicut and back again? What kind of reception would the Portuguese receive when they arrived? What goods did the Indian market want, and what could Portugal offer in exchange? How long would such a voyage take, and how many men and ships would be needed to sustain it at the end of a supply chain that stretched 15,000 miles back to Lisbon? These were not rhetorical questions. They were practical problems that had to be solved before the India voyage could be attempted, and solving them took 9 years. During those years, the Portuguese gathered intelligence through every channel available to them. They sent Pero da Covilhã overland, through Egypt, Arabia, and the East African coast, to gather information about the Indian Ocean trade routes from the inside, travelling as a merchant and spy in Muslim lands, where a Portuguese Christian was not exactly welcome. Covilhã reached India, spent years travelling through the Indian Ocean world, and sent back reports that confirmed the practicability of the sea route from the Cape. He also found his way to Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom that had long been associated with the legend of Prester John, where the emperor welcomed him so enthusiastically that he never quite managed to leave. He was still there, an old man with an Ethiopian wife and family, when the next Portuguese embassy arrived 30 years later. The shipyards of the Tagus were busy during those 9 years, building the heavier vessels that the India voyage would require. The light caravels that had served so well along the African coast were not suited for the longer, rougher passages of the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and the new ships, the Norse, the large carracks, were squarer, heavier, more capacious, and more heavily armed. They were designed to carry not just trade goods but soldiers and cannon, because the Portuguese understood from Covilhã's intelligence that India was not an empty coastline waiting to be claimed. It was a world of sophisticated kingdoms and established merchants who would not simply surrender their trade on Portuguese demand. Force would be needed. The India voyage was from the beginning a military as well as a commercial expedition, and yet 9 years passed between Dias's return and the departure of the expedition that would actually reach India. 9 years in which the Portuguese king absorbed the intelligence of what Dias had found, planned, gathered resources, and was distracted by other events, including, as we shall see, a piece of news that arrived from the west, from the direction of Spain, in the spring of 1493, that changed every calculation. Because while Dias was rounding the Cape of Good Hope, a man named Christopher Columbus was in Portugal, trying to get someone to fund a very different kind of voyage. Christopher Columbus was not Spanish. He was Genoese, born in the city of Genoa on the northwestern coast of Italy sometime around 1451, the son of a wool weaver named Domenico Colombo and his wife Susanna Fontanarossa. He went to sea young. He claimed to have first sailed at the age of 10, which is probably an exaggeration, but he was certainly at sea by his teens, and by his early 20s he was in Lisbon, which in the 1470s was the most exciting port city in the Western world, the place where the ships came back from Africa with gold and ivory and enslaved people, and tales of a continent that stretched forever southward. Columbus absorbed all of it. He learned Portuguese, which he would speak and write for the rest of his life better than Spanish. He sailed on Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, and possibly as far north as Ireland and Iceland. He married a Portuguese woman of noble family and settled for a time in Madeira, the Atlantic island that Portugal had settled and transformed into a sugar-producing colony, the first in the Atlantic, a model for everything that would follow in the Americas. He read obsessively. Marco Polo's account of Asia, Ptolemy's geography, the works of the Florentine cosmographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who had argued in a famous letter to a Portuguese official that a westward route to Asia was feasible. He accumulated charts and books, filled their margins with notes, and constructed in his mind an image of the world that was, and this is the crucial point, importantly wrong. The error was one of scale. Columbus believed, based on his reading of ancient and medieval authorities and his own calculations, that Asia was much closer to Europe going westward than it actually is. He had a number of sources for this belief, some of them reputable scholars who had made reasonable estimates, and some of them less reliable, and he synthesized them in a way that supported his preferred conclusion that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was approximately 2,400 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,000 miles, with 2 entire continents in the way. Columbus was not simply being optimistic. He was working from a systematic misreading of the available evidence, and he clung to it with the tenacity of a man who had staked his entire reputation and career on a single idea. He presented this idea to the Portuguese crown in or around 1484. John II, who was in the middle of the African exploration program and who had access to the best geographical expertise available, convened a commission of experts to evaluate the proposal. The commission rejected it, apparently on the correct grounds that Columbus had significantly underestimated the size of the world and that his proposed route to Asia was impractically long. Columbus was not merely rejected, he was, by his own later account, treated dismissively, though some historians think he exaggerated the hostility of his reception for dramatic effect. What is certain is that he left Portugal without the backing he sought and took his proposal elsewhere. He tried the Genoese. They were not interested. He tried the Venetians. They were not interested. He tried England, possibly, though the historical evidence is thin, and he went to Spain, where in 1486 he managed to secure an audience with the recently united monarchs of Castile and Aragon, Isabella and Ferdinand. This was the couple who had completed the Reconquista, the 7th century Christian military campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, just months earlier, when Granada fell in January of 1492. They had also, in March of 1492, issued the Alhambra Decree expelling all Jews from Spain, one of the largest forced displacements in medieval history. They were, in short, people in an expansionist mood. The Spanish crown set up its own commission to evaluate Columbus's proposal, and this commission also found against him, again on sound geographical grounds. For the next several years, Columbus existed in a kind of limbo at the edge of the Spanish court. His proposal, technically rejected but never entirely buried, kept alive partly by his own relentless advocacy and partly by the patronage of a few powerful nobles and clerics who believed in him, or at least found him interesting. He began negotiations with Portugal again, and these apparently went far enough to alarm the Spanish, who did not want to lose the deal to their rivals. In April of 1492, with the Reconquista triumphantly concluded and the mood at court one of religious and military expansion, Isabella and Ferdinand finally said yes. The terms of the agreement, the capitulations of Santa Fe, were extravagant by the standards of any rational risk assessment. Columbus was to receive the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, to be named Viceroy and Governor-General of any lands he discovered, and to receive 10% of all revenues from those lands in perpetuity. These were the terms of a man who had been negotiating for years and was not willing to accept anything less than the moon, and they would cause enormous legal headaches for his heirs for decades to come. But in April of 1492 they were theoretical promises to be paid out of theoretical wealth for a voyage that the experts had said would probably fail. Columbus sailed from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492, with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and his flagship the Santa Maria, and approximately 90 men. The fleet stopped at the Canary Islands to make repairs and take on provisions, and then on September 6 they struck out westward into the open Atlantic, beyond the range of any previous voyage, into the emptiness that no European had ever entered with the intention of crossing. What followed was 33 days of open ocean sailing, which sounds straightforward but was an exercise in sustained psychological pressure that should not be underestimated. The men had no way of knowing where they were going or when they would arrive. The pilots tracked their position by dead reckoning, calculating their location from their speed, direction, and time elapsed, which accumulated errors over time and which none of them could fully trust. The magnetic compass behaved strangely as they moved west, the needle drifting from true north in ways that Columbus managed to explain away without fully understanding. The winds blew from the east with a steadiness that carried them forward effortlessly, but also raised the terrifying question of whether those winds ever reversed, or whether they were sailing into a one-way current from which there was no return. On September 25th, one of the pilots called land. It was a false alarm. Clouds on the horizon probably, or a bank of sargassum weed, but the effect on morale was visceral. Hope followed immediately by despair. There were other false sightings. Other brief lifts of spirit quickly dashed. By early October, the crew's anxiety was reaching a dangerous level, and Columbus, according to his own log, was managing it carefully, minimizing the distances travelled in the records he shared with his men, while maintaining a private log that showed the true distances, all while projecting a confidence that he may not entirely have felt. On October 11th, 1492, the signs multiplied. Green branches in the water, a carved stick, a land bird. At 2 in the morning on October the 12th, a sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana shouted the word that every man on the 3 ships had been waiting 33 days to hear. Tierra, land. Columbus came ashore the following morning on an island he named San Salvador. Scholars have argued for centuries about which island in the Bahamas this actually was, with several candidates proposed and none definitively confirmed, though most modern scholarship leans toward Watling Island, now called San Salvador, as the most likely candidate, and performed the legal ceremony of possession, planting the royal standard of Spain in the sand and claiming the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. The people who were already on the island watched him do this. They were the Taino, a people who had lived in the Caribbean for centuries, and they came to the beach to observe these strange visitors with their enormous boats and their shining metal and their incomprehensible clothing, curious and wary in roughly equal measure. Columbus, who had expected to arrive in the outer islands of Asia, looked at them and wrote in his log that they seemed gentle and could easily be converted to Christianity, and that they would make good servants. The weeks that followed were a tour of the northern Caribbean, guided partly by the Taino people Columbus had taken aboard, and partly by his own guesswork. He found Cuba, so large that he convinced himself it was the Malay Peninsula, the eastern extremity of the Asian mainland. He found Hispaniola, the island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where the soil was fertile and the Taino people wore, in their hair and around their necks, small ornaments of gold. Gold was what the Spanish court expected, and Columbus was careful to note every piece of it in his log, describing the island's wealth in terms that grew more extravagant with each entry, whether or not the evidence on the ground justified the description. He was a man who needed to deliver on the promises he had made, and the pressure of that need coloured everything he wrote about the lands he was discovering. On Christmas Eve, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola, and the damage was severe enough that she could not be saved. Columbus had to make the best of the disaster, and the best he could make of it was a fort. He had the Santa Maria's timber dismantled and used to build a small fortification on the shore which he named La Navidad, Christmas, and in which he left 39 volunteers, the overflow from the 2 smaller ships when he finally sailed back to Spain in January of 1493. They were the first European settlers in the Americas since the Norse had abandoned their Vinland settlements in Newfoundland 5 centuries earlier. When Columbus returned on his second voyage in November of 1493, he found La Navidad burned to the ground and the 39 men dead, killed in a conflict with the local Taino chief, whose cause and exact circumstances were never established to anyone's satisfaction. The first European settlement in the Americas had lasted less than a year. The first voyage continued through the Caribbean, Cuba, which Columbus convinced himself was the Malay Peninsula, Hispaniola, which he called La Española, and where the Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day, forcing Columbus to build a small fort from her timber and leave 39 men behind when he sailed back to Spain. He returned to Palos in March of 1493 with a handful of Taino people, some parrots, some gold ornaments, and a story that would remake the world. He never reached Asia. He never understood that he had not reached Asia. To his dying day, he maintained that the lands he had found were part of the Asian landmass, and his obstinacy on this point would complicate the legal and geographical understanding of what he had actually discovered for years after his death. But the news he carried back in the spring of 1493 arrived in Lisbon before it reached the Spanish court. Columbus stopped in Lisbon technically, and had an audience with Joan II before proceeding to Barcelona, and in Lisbon it caused immediate alarm. Joan II understood, or suspected, that what Columbus had found was not Asia, but something new, and that it might lie within the sphere of influence that Portugal had been building for itself along the African coast and in the Atlantic. The 2 Iberian powers were suddenly in direct competition, and a conflict was possible. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary pieces of diplomatic geography and history. The instrument through which Portugal and Spain attempted to resolve their suddenly very complicated territorial rivalry was the papacy. In the spring of 1493, Columbus had barely finished reporting to the Spanish monarchs when Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, one of the most controversial figures ever to occupy the papal throne, and a Spaniard by birth who owed his election partly to Spanish patronage, issued a series of bulls that attempted to settle the question of who owned the newly discovered lands. The first two bulls, issued in May of 1493, granted Spain's sovereignty over lands discovered or to be discovered west of a line drawn 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. A third bull extended this to a general grant of sovereignty over all lands in the Western Ocean. The Portuguese were furious. The line as drawn would have cut into territories they considered theirs, including the Cape Verde Islands and potentially the route around Africa that they had been building toward for decades. Jerome II refused to accept the papal division and demanded renegotiation directly with Spain, bypassing the Pope whose impartiality he clearly questioned. What followed was a negotiation between the two kingdoms that, by any reasonable measure, should have taken years and teams of lawyers and the intervention of multiple mediators. It took a matter of weeks conducted in the small Spanish town of Tordesillas in June of 1494 and produced a treaty that moved the dividing line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, considerably further west than the Pope had originally proposed, and far enough west that it included a substantial slice of what would eventually be found to be the eastern bulge of South America. The territory that would become Brazil, in other words, fell on the Portuguese side of the line, a fact that would become evident to everyone when Pedro Alvarez Cabral arrived there in 1500, and which some historians believe Portugal may have already suspected, possibly from secret voyages whose records have not survived, when they negotiated for the further west line at Tordesillas. The treaty is a remarkable document in its own right, quite apart from the staggering territorial presumption it represented. Two kingdoms between them agreed to divide the entire globe, including all the lands that had not yet been discovered, into exclusive spheres of influence. Spain would have the west, Portugal would have the east. The people who actually lived in these vast territories were not consulted. The treaty assumed that sovereignty over inhabited lands could be transferred by a line drawn on a map in a Spanish town by negotiators who had never been to most of the places they were dividing. It was a document that could only have been produced by a civilization that had already decided on religious and racial grounds that the rules that applied between Christian kingdoms did not apply between Christian kingdoms and everyone else. The line itself, the line of demarcation, ran through the Atlantic at roughly the 46th meridian west, although the technology of the day made its precise location somewhat uncertain. Longitude was, in 1494, far harder to calculate accurately than latitude, and neither Portugal nor Spain had reliable methods for determining exactly where the line fell in the Pacific Ocean, on the other side of the world. This ambiguity would become a serious problem decades later, when Magellan circumnavigated the globe and the question of where the line continued on the other side became urgent and intensely contested. But in 1494, the Pacific was not on anyone's immediate agenda. The immediate agendas were Africa and the Caribbean. The negotiations themselves were conducted with a mixture of genuine diplomatic skill and calculated bluffing on both sides. The Portuguese negotiators, who arrived at Tordesillas with the accumulated intelligence of decades of Atlantic sailing behind them, had reasons to believe that pushing the line further west served their interests, partly because it gave their African routes more comfortable buffer, and partly because they may have had information, from secret voyages or from the reports of pilots who had sailed deep into the South Atlantic in search of the Cape winds, that there was land to the west that the further west line would place on their side. This hypothesis, that Portugal knew about Brazil before Tordesillas, cannot be proven definitively, but the Portuguese negotiating position at Tordesillas, which pushed hard and successfully for the more westward placement of the line, is difficult to explain on purely defensive grounds. The Spanish negotiators, by contrast, were working largely in the dark about what the further west line might mean. They understood that Columbus had found islands and possibly a continental coast to the west, but they had no clear sense yet of the full extent of the western lands, and they seem to have calculated that moving the line westward cost them nothing of immediate importance, while buying Portuguese agreement. In retrospect, the Spanish negotiators gave away Brazil at Tordesillas, though neither side knew it yet. For Portugal, the treaty confirmed what the crown had been building towards since Henry the Navigator funded his first expeditions, a legitimate internationally recognised monopoly on the eastward route to Asia. The line put Africa on the Portuguese side, put India on the Portuguese side, put the entire Indian Ocean on the Portuguese side. All Portugal had to do was get there. For Spain, the treaty confirmed the western route, and everything Columbus had found or might yet find. The Caribbean islands and whatever lay beyond them were Spain's. The question of what exactly lay beyond them, whether it was Asia or something else entirely, was still unresolved in 1494 and would remain so for years. The Pope who had drafted the original bulls was not entirely pleased to be bypassed in the final negotiation, but Alexander VI had enough of his own problems, the political intrigues of the Italian Renaissance, the ambitions of his son Cesare Borgia, the complex rivalries of the major European powers, that he ratified the treaty and moved on. Other European powers, including France, England, and later the Netherlands, simply ignored it. The French King Francis I reportedly asked to be shown the clause in Adam's will that gave Spain and Portugal the world, and the line that the two Iberian powers had drawn became, for everyone outside Iberia, less a legal boundary than a declaration of intent that would eventually be tested and found wanting. But that reckoning was still decades away. In the immediate wake of Tordesillas, both Portugal and Spain returned to the work of actually reaching the destinations the treaty had assigned them. For Spain, this meant more voyages to the Caribbean, and the gradual, confused, and violent process of understanding that the lands Columbus had found were not Asia. For Portugal, it meant finally, after 9 years of preparation since Dias had rounded the Cape, sending the fleet that would reach India. But before we follow those fleets, it is worth pausing for a moment on what this era of exploration meant for the people who stayed home. The families in Lisbon and Seville and Porto who watched the ships depart and then waited, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. The history of the Age of Discovery tends to be told through its captains and its kings, its battles and its discoveries, but behind every ship that left the Tagus or the Guadalquivir was a household in which someone was left behind to manage the children, tend the business, pay the debts, and wait for the women of the Portuguese merchant and noble class. And it was overwhelmingly women who waited, since the ships were crewed almost entirely by men. The waiting was a practical as much as an emotional challenge. Husbands who went east might be gone for 2 years, 3 years, longer. They might not come back at all. The mortality rate on the India run was high enough in the early decades that a man who sailed for Goa had a meaningful chance of dying of disease, shipwreck, or violence before he could return. Property had to be managed, accounts kept, children raised, disputes settled, all in the context of a legal system that granted women limited formal authority, but required them constantly to exercise informal authority in the absence of the men who held the formal kind. The wives and mothers and sisters of the Age of Discovery were, in their quiet way, managing the other half of the imperial project, the domestic half, the economic foundation that made it possible for the men to be gone. For ordinary sailors and soldiers, the men who crewed the ships without the benefit of a share in the profits, the rewards were less obvious and the risks were the same. A common sailor on the India run might return with enough to buy a small house or pay off a debt, or he might return with nothing but the clothes on his back and a body damaged by scurvy and tropical fevers. He might not return at all, dying of dysentery in a hospital in Goa, or going down with his ship in a storm off the Cape. The chroniclers noted the great captains and their achievements. They did not generally note the names of the men who pulled the ropes and bailed the holds and died in the foreign harbour, far from home, without the recognition that history reserves for those who give orders rather than those who carry them out. And yet those men made it possible. Every voyage of discovery was, at its base, a collective human achievement, the product of dozens or hundreds of individual decisions, to keep going, to endure, to trust the captain's navigation when the stars seemed wrong and the provisions were running low. The courage of the ordinary sailor is not a lesser courage than the courage of Vasco da Gama or Magellan. It is simply a courage that history has not troubled to name. The man who led that fleet was Vasco da Gama, and his voyage in 1497 and 1498 was, in its strategic and historical consequences, possibly the single most important voyage in the history of oceanic exploration. Vasco da Gama was not the obvious choice for the command. Bartolomeo Diaz, who had rounded the Cape, was the more experienced navigator and by any reasonable standard had earned the right to complete the journey he had begun. But command of a major royal expedition was not just a maritime appointment. It was a diplomatic mission, a political statement, and a military operation all at once. And the Portuguese crown appears to have decided that it required a man with a combination of courtly, standing, ruthless determination and flexible authority that da Gama offered. Diaz was eventually given command of one of the supply ships in the fleet and would later command other voyages, including the one on which he died in a storm off the Cape of Good Hope in 1500, a grimly appropriate fate for the man who had first passed it. Da Gama's fleet consisted of 4 ships, the São Gabriel and the São Rafael, each of about 200 tons, squarer and more heavily built than the caravels of the earlier African voyages, the Berrio, a smaller caravel, and a supply ship. The fleet carried approximately 170 men and supplies for 3 years, which gives some sense of the scale of what was planned and the uncertainty about how long it would take. It also carried trade goods intended for the Indian market: cloth, coral, sugar, oil, honey, which would prove woefully inadequate for the sophisticated markets of the Indian Ocean, causing considerable embarrassment. They sailed from Lisbon on July 8, 1497, and what followed was a masterclass in oceanic navigation that reflected everything Portugal had learned in 50 years of Atlantic sailing. Rather than following the coast of Africa southward, as the earlier expeditions had done, da Gama swung far out into the Atlantic to the southwest, using the great circular current patterns of the South Atlantic, patterns that Portuguese navigators had been quietly learning for decades, to find favourable winds for rounding the Cape. This extraordinary loop, which took him far into the open ocean before curving back to Africa, was perhaps 3,000 miles of additional sailing compared to the coastal route, but it was faster and far less dangerous because it avoided the contrary winds of the African coast. It demonstrated a level of meteorological and navigational knowledge that was, by the standards of 1497, simply extraordinary. Da Gama rounded the Cape in early November, paused at Mossel Bay, where Diaz had been 9 years earlier, and then continued east and north along the Mozambique Channel, into the Indian Ocean, into waters where Arab dhows had been sailing for centuries. Here the character of the voyage changed completely. He was no longer in unknown territory. He was entering a world that had its own dense networks of trade, its own sophisticated city-states, its own diplomatic protocols, a world that had been functioning perfectly well for a very long time without any Portuguese involvement, and which would regard these strange armed visitors from Europe with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and, when the hostility became apparent, fear and anger. The Swahili coast that da Gama encountered, the string of Muslim trading cities running from Mozambique through present-day Tanzania and Kenya, was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and deeply integrated into the Indian Ocean trading system. The merchants of Kilwa and Mombasa and Malindi traded with Arabia, Persia, India, and China. They spoke Swahili and Arabic and the commercial languages of the Indian Ocean world. They had been doing this for centuries. Da Gama arrived with his ships and his trade goods, and his Christian icons and his obvious military capability, and presented himself as an agent of a king who wished to trade and explore. But the trade goods he carried were laughably inferior to what was available in any Swahili port, and the intentions behind the military preparation were not entirely obscure. Relations at Mozambique and then Mombasa were tense, and ultimately broke down into confrontations. Da Gama's men seized Arab pilots, tortured them for information, and threatened local rulers with cannon fire when they felt they were not being given what they wanted. At Malindi, however, which happened to be a rival of Mombasa, and therefore had an interest in any power that threatened Mombasa, the Portuguese found a more cooperative reception, and here they secured the most crucial resource of the entire voyage, a pilot who knew the Indian Ocean. His name, in Portuguese records, is Ahmad ibn Majid, or sometimes Ibn Majid, though historians debate whether this was truly the famous Arab navigator of that name, or another pilot bearing a similar name. Regardless of identity, what mattered was competence. The pilot knew the routes, knew the monsoon winds, and could take the Portuguese across the Arabian Sea to India. The crossing took 23 days. On May 20th, 1498, the fleet arrived at Calicut, on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, one of the major spice ports of the Indian Ocean world, ruled by a Hindu king known as the Zamarin. They had done it. They had reached India by sea, the route that Henry the Navigator had imagined, that Dias had half completed, that Tordesillas had assigned to Portugal, was now real. The harbour of Calicut in 1498 was one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Ships from Arabia, Persia, Gujarat, Bengal, Java, China and East Africa rode at anchor in its roads, loading and unloading goods that represented the full range of what the Indian Ocean world produced and desired. The port's markets sold pepper by the sack and cinnamon by the bundle, and the Zamorin's customs officials collected duties with the practiced efficiency of a state that had been doing this for generations. Into this world, with its established protocols and commercial networks and diplomatic customs, da Gama arrived, technically as an ambassador of the King of Portugal, bearing gifts that the Indian courtiers found somewhat underwhelming. The problem was cultural as much as commercial. Da Gama had brought the trade goods that would have impressed a West African market or perhaps a modestly wealthy Mediterranean merchant. Cloth, hats, coral, wash basins, strings of honey. The Zamorin's officials, who were accustomed to Chinese silks and Persian metalwork and Arabian thoroughbreds, looked at what da Gama had brought and suggested, apparently without excessive diplomacy, that these were not gifts fit for a king. The Muslim merchants of Calicut, who understood exactly what da Gama's arrival meant for the trade routes they controlled, were working actively to undermine the Portuguese mission, assuring the Zamorin that these newcomers were not the wealthy ambassadors of a great king they claimed to be, but common merchants and possibly pirates. The Portuguese were caught between the commercial interest of the Muslims and the Zamorin's own scepticism, and the audience da Gama finally obtained, after days of waiting and frustration, did not produce the commercial treaty he needed. But da Gama was not a man who accepted gracefully what he could not immediately obtain. He was by all accounts harsh, stubborn, and capable of violence when he considered it necessary, and these qualities would become more apparent on his subsequent voyages. On the first voyage, he managed to acquire a modest cargo of spice through direct purchases and departed Calicut in August of 1498, leaving behind 4 men as involuntary representatives of the Portuguese crown, and taking away a number of Indian men as equally involuntary representatives of the Zamorin's court. The return voyage was catastrophic. Without the pilot's knowledge of the best routes, sailing against the monsoon, the crossing of the Arabian Sea took 3 months instead of 3 weeks. Scurvy devastated the crew. 30 men died. By the time they rounded the Cape and began the long run north along the African coast, the São Rafael was so short-handed that it had to be burned rather than sailed. Da Gama reached Lisbon in September of 1499, 2 years and 2 months after he had left, with 2 of his 4 ships and barely half his men. His brother Paulo, who had commanded the São Rafael, died of tuberculosis on the voyage home and was buried in the Azores. And yet the cargo he brought back, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger and other spices, was worth, according to contemporary estimates, 60 times the cost of the entire voyage. 60 times. The profit was so staggering that it rendered every previous European commercial calculation obsolete. The Portuguese crown had not just opened a trade route, it had found a machine for generating wealth on a scale that had no precedent in European experience, and it was going to defend that machine with everything it had. What followed in the next decade was a campaign of economic and military domination of the Indian Ocean trade routes that was brutally efficient and brazenly violent. The Portuguese strategy, developed by the Viceroy Afonso de Albuquerque in the years after 1505, was to seize control of the key choke points of the Indian Ocean system, the straits and harbours through which all trade necessarily flowed, and force every merchant vessel to operate under Portuguese licence, paying for a cartas, a pass, or risk having their ships seized or destroyed. It was, in essence, a protection racket on a continental scale, and it worked because the Portuguese carracks and galleons, with their cannon and their hardened crews, could outfight anything the Indian Ocean world had previously produced. In 1510, Albuquerque captured Goa, on the west coast of India, which would become the capital of the Estado de India, the Portuguese maritime empire of the East, and would remain a Portuguese possession until 1961. In 1511, he captured Malacca, the narrow strait through which all trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea flowed, effectively cutting off the Muslim merchants who had previously dominated this route. In 1515 he took Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, another of the great choke points of Asian trade. The system was almost complete, a network of fortified trading posts and naval bases stretching from East Africa to India to Southeast Asia, through which Portugal proposed to channel and tax the entire spice trade of the Indian Ocean world. It was not a settlement empire in the way that Spain's American empire would become. The Portuguese were too few and the distances too great for anything like that. It was a trading empire, a commercial empire, maintained by naval force and the constant presence of armed ships. And it was, for several decades, extraordinarily profitable. The prices of spice in Lisbon fell dramatically, as the Portuguese supply replaced the Ottoman-mediated overland routes. The Portuguese crown grew wealthy beyond previous imagination, and the small kingdom at the edge of Europe, which had fewer than 1 million inhabitants in 1500, found itself the master of a commercial network that spanned half the globe. While Portugal was building its empire of trading posts and naval supremacy in the east, Spain was engaged in a very different kind of imperial project in the west, one that was, in terms of raw violence and demographic catastrophe, probably the most destructive episode of conquest in human history. Columbus's later voyages, he made 3 more between 1493 and 1504, gradually expanded Spanish knowledge of the Caribbean and touched the coasts of Central and South America, but they did not resolve the fundamental confusion about what had been found. Columbus went to his grave insisting that he had reached Asia, his insistence growing more brittle and defensive as it became harder to reconcile with the actual evidence. Other explorers were less committed to the Asian hypothesis. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator who sailed on Spanish and Portuguese expeditions along the South American coast between 1499 and 1504, was among the first to argue clearly in published accounts that this was a new continent, a mundus novus, a new world, entirely unknown to the ancient geographers. A German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller read Vespucci's accounts, and in 1507 produced a map that labelled the new continent America after the Latinized version of Amerigo. The name stuck to Columbus's posthumous misfortune. The mechanism through which Spain converted its Caribbean foothold into a continental empire was the conquistador, the Spanish soldier-adventurer, operating on royal license but largely self-financing, who led small groups of men into the interior of the Americas and conquered, by a combination of military force, political manipulation, epidemic disease, and sheer ruthless determination, empires far larger and more populous than anything they could have imagined in Europe. The first and in some ways the most dramatic of these conquests was Hernán Cortés's campaign against the Aztec Empire in Mexico between 1519 and 1521. Cortés was a lawyer by training who had come to the Caribbean in 1504 and spent 15 years in the Spanish settlements there, accumulating property and experience and a restless ambition that the relative backwater of Hispaniola could not satisfy. In 1518, the governor of Cuba commissioned him to lead an expedition to the Mexican coast, then revoked the commission when Cortés's independent spirit became apparent, and Cortés simply sailed anyway, with 11 ships, 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and the absolute certainty, which he seems to have carried with him as naturally as his sword, that he was going to succeed. The Mexico he entered was dominated by the Aztec Triple Alliance, a confederacy of city-states centered on Tenochtitlan, the extraordinary island city in the middle of Lake Texcoco, whose population of 200,000 to 300,000 made it larger than any city in Europe. The Aztec state was powerful, sophisticated, and deeply militarized. It had been expanding aggressively for decades, extracting tribute from subject peoples across central Mexico, and feeding its elaborate religious calendar with the captives that those campaigns produced. It was also, from Cortés's perspective, usefully vulnerable to the resentments of its subject peoples. Cortés allied himself with the Tlaxcalans and other indigenous groups who hated Aztec rule, adding thousands of indigenous warriors to his small Spanish corps. He marched to Tenochtitlan and was admitted, in circumstances that are still disputed by historians, as a guest of the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II, whom he then effectively took hostage, attempting to rule through him. The situation deteriorated into open warfare, and in the Noche Triste, the sad night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish and their allies were driven from Tenochtitlan with catastrophic losses. Cortés regrouped, besieged the city, and on August 13th, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell after a siege that reduced much of it to rubble and killed tens of thousands of its people. The speed of the conquest, from first landing in Mexico to the fall of Tenochtitlan was barely 2.5 years, has fascinated and troubled historians ever since. The explanations are multiple and contested. The political fractures in Aztec society that Cortés exploited, the military advantages of Spanish horses, steel weapons and firearms, the catastrophic impact of smallpox, which arrived in the Americas in 1519 and swept through populations that had no immunity, killing perhaps a third to a half of the indigenous population of central Mexico in the first epidemic alone, and, not to be discounted, the extraordinary personal capabilities of Cortés himself, his tactical brilliance, his political intelligence, his willingness to commit to an all-or-nothing strategy that left him no retreat and therefore required him to succeed. There is also the factor of speed itself. The conquest of Mexico was so swift, so disorienting that the Aztec state never had time to fully mobilize the resources it possessed. The Aztec military was formidable. It had conquered an empire, but it was organized around a different kind of war, a ritual warfare designed to take captives rather than destroy enemies utterly, conducted between armies that understood the same rules. The Spanish did not understand those rules, did not observe them, and did not slow down enough for the Aztec leadership to develop an adequate response. Moctezuma's initial attempt to manage the situation diplomatically, to receive Cortés as a guest, to understand his intentions, to respond to this strange intrusion within the frameworks of Aztec political tradition, was the wrong response to a situation that had no precedent, and by the time it became apparent that diplomacy was not going to work, the Spanish were already inside the city. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro repeated this achievement at a scale that makes it even more difficult to comprehend. In 1532, Pizarro arrived at the Inca Empire in Peru with a force of 168 men and 27 horses. The Inca Empire was the largest state in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching along the Pacific coast and into the Andes from present-day Colombia to Chile, with a population of perhaps 12 million people. Pizarro captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa by an act of audacious treachery at the city of Cajamarca, inviting him to a formal meeting, then attacking his entourage without warning in a massacre that killed thousands of unarmed attendants and left the Inca ruler himself, despite the chaos, taken alive, and held Atahualpa for a ransom that produced a room full of gold and 2 rooms full of silver, the largest ransom in history by some estimates. The room in which Atahualpa promised to fill the space with gold measured roughly 17 feet by 22 feet and was to be filled to a height of 8 feet, an almost impossible quantity of precious metal gathered from across the empire. Then he had Atahualpa executed anyway and proceeded to conquer the empire, a betrayal so naked that even some of Pizarro's own men reportedly questioned it at the time, though not loudly enough to change the outcome. The gold and silver of the Americas flowed into Spain in quantities that transformed not just Spain, but the entire European economy. The silver mines of Potosí, discovered in 1545 in what is now Bolivia, at an altitude of more than 13,000 feet, produced more silver in the 16th and 17th centuries than the rest of the world's mines combined. The mountain itself, called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain, was by the end of the 16th century honeycombed with tunnels to such an extent that sections of it had begun to collapse inward, and the men working those tunnels were indigenous labourers brought to Potosí under a revised version of the Inca Mita, the labour draft, who worked in conditions of darkness, cold, altitude sickness, and mercury poisoning, mercury being essential to the amalgamation process used to extract silver from ore, that killed them at rates which ensured a constant demand for replacement. It is estimated that 8 million people died in the silver mines of the colonial Americas over 2 centuries, a figure whose enormity can be grasped intellectually, but which resist full emotional comprehension. The writer Eduardo Galeano once described Potosí as a mountain that ate men, and the image, once encountered, is difficult to displace. The silver was minted into coins and shipped to Spain on the great fleets of galleons that crossed the Atlantic twice a year. The Flota de Indias, the Indies fleet, in a convoy system developed to protect against the pirates and privateers that the Caribbean quickly attracted, once the scale of Spain's wealth became apparent. The convoys were massive, sometimes 40 or 50 ships escorted by armed galleons following routes that the trade winds made almost as predictable as roads. Their predictability was, from a security standpoint, a vulnerability. Every pirate and privateer in the Atlantic knew when and where the fleet would pass. The treasure ships were attacked, sunk, scattered by storms and occasionally captured. But the system endured for 2 centuries because the losses, though spectacular, were small compared to the total flow of silver that completed the crossing successfully. From Spain, the silver dispersed throughout the European economy, flowing east to pay for goods from Asia, north to pay for the debts and wars that Spain's continental ambitions accumulated, and further east still to China, where it was the primary currency for buying the silk and porcelain that the global economy demanded. Potosí silver, in a very real sense, paid for the world's first global economy. A Spanish coin minted from Peruvian silver might pay a German mercenary who spent it in a Dutch market where it bought Indian cotton, whose producer in Gujarat accepted it because it would eventually buy Chinese silk. The world was not just connected by exploration, it was connected by money, and the money came from a mountain in the Andes that nobody in Europe had known existed 40 years before Columbus sailed. The human cost of this wealth was enormous and almost incomprehensible. The indigenous population of the Americas, which modern demographic historians estimate at somewhere between 40 and 80 million people before contact with Europeans, was devastated by the combination of epidemic disease, forced labour, warfare, and the disruption of traditional food systems. By 1600, the population of central Mexico had fallen from perhaps 25 million to around 1 million. The Caribbean islands where the Spanish first settled were essentially depopulated within a generation of contact. The Taino people whom Columbus had met in 1492 and described as gentle and capable of conversion had been worked to death, died of disease, or been killed in resistance and its suppression by the time anyone in Spain thought to document their existence systematically. The labour gap created by this demographic catastrophe was filled, progressively, by enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic, a trade that Portugal had begun in the 1440s along the West African coast, and that now expanded enormously to feed the labour demands of Spanish colonial agriculture and Portuguese sugar production in Brazil. The Atlantic slave trade, which would eventually transport somewhere between 12 and 15 million Africans to the Americas over 4 centuries, was a direct consequence of the Age of Discovery and the particular form of colonial economy that the Iberian powers had established. None of this was invisible to contemporaries who cared to look. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 as a slaveholder and landowner, participated in the conquest of Cuba, and underwent a conversion, gradual and painful and never entirely complete, to the understanding that what was being done to the indigenous people of the Americas was a moral catastrophe. His Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a searing account of Spanish atrocities written in 1542 and published in 1552, shocked many of its European readers and contributed to a genuine debate within the Spanish Church and Crown about the legal and moral status of indigenous peoples. The debate resulted in the new laws of 1542, which theoretically abolished indigenous slavery and the encomienda system, the grants of indigenous labour that had underwritten the conquest economy. In practice, the new laws were difficult to enforce at a distance of several thousand miles, and were partially revoked after violent resistance from the colonial elite. But the debate itself was significant. It represented the beginning of what we might recognise in a very limited and self-interested way as a struggle over the moral meaning of empire conducted largely within the framework of Catholic theology, but raising questions that would not find satisfying answers for centuries, and in some respects have still not found them. None of this was invisible to contemporaries who cared to look. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 as a slaveholder and landowner, participated in the conquest of Cuba, and underwent a conversion, gradual and painful and never entirely complete, to the understanding that what was being done to the indigenous people of the Americas was a moral catastrophe. His Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a searing account of Spanish atrocities written in 1542 and published in 1552, shocked many of its European readers and contributed to a genuine debate within the Spanish Church and Crown about the legal and moral status of indigenous peoples. The debate resulted in the new laws of 1542, which theoretically abolished indigenous slavery and the encomienda system, the grants of indigenous labour that had underwritten the conquest economy. In practice, the new laws were difficult to enforce at a distance of several thousand miles, and were partially revoked after violent resistance from the colonial elite. The most extraordinary episode in this moral debate was the Valladolid controversy of 1550 and 1551, in which the Spanish crown, under Charles V, who was troubled by the contradictions between his Christian faith and the reports coming from the Americas, convened a formal debate about the justice of the conquest itself. On one side was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a humanist scholar who argued, drawing on Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were natural inferiors who benefited from being conquered by a superior Christian civilization. On the other side was Las Casas himself, then in his late 70s and burning with a moral urgency that he had been carrying for decades, who argued that the indigenous peoples were fully rational human beings, possessed of all the rights that natural law conferred on human beings, and that the conquest was not merely unjust, but a systematic crime for which Spain would eventually answer before God. The debate was inconclusive, neither side convinced the other, no binding judgment was issued, and the conquest continued regardless. But it represented something genuinely significant in the intellectual history of the West. A formal attempt to apply European moral philosophy to the question of empire, conducted not by outsiders, but by people inside the imperial system, with the knowledge and, in Las Casas's case, the guilt that came from having participated in what they were debating. The argument that indigenous peoples were fully human, that their cultures had value, that their rights could not simply be dissolved by the fact of conquest. These arguments would not achieve political traction for centuries, but they were made, loudly and clearly, at the height of Spain's imperial power, and the fact that they were made matters. What followed in the next 2 centuries was the slow institutionalization of the colonial relationship, the creation of the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, the development of a complex social hierarchy based on race and place of birth, the establishment of universities and cathedrals and printing presses that made the Spanish Americas the most literate part of the New World, and the continuation, barely moderated by any of the laws or debates, of the forced labour and the violence that underpinned it all. It was an empire of profound contradictions, deeply Catholic and deeply brutal, intellectually sophisticated and racially organised, producing extraordinary works of literature and architecture and music on the labour of people who had no choice but to provide it. To understand what Portugal was, building in the east while Spain was destroying and creating in the west, it helps to think in terms of nodes and networks rather than territories and settlements. The Estado da India, the State of India, as the Portuguese called their Eastern Empire, was not a colony in the conventional sense of a territory occupied and administered by settlers from the mother country. It was a maritime network, a series of fortified trading posts, coastal cities, and naval bases connected by sea routes that Portugal sought to monopolise, through which it proposed to channel and tax the most valuable commodities the world produced. The architect of this system was Afonso de Albuquerque, who served as governor of the Estado de India from 1509 to 1515, and who combined, in proportions that his contemporaries found both inspiring and terrifying, military genius, political vision, and a capacity for calculated cruelty that he regarded as simply the price of empire. Albuquerque was not a man who conquered territories by accident or opportunity. He had a strategic plan, and the plan was based on a clear-eyed understanding of the geography of Asian trade. The spices of Southeast Asia, the nutmeg and cloves that came from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, arrived at the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Malacca, the narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. All the pepper of India was traded through the ports of the Malabar coast, especially Calicut and Cochin. All the goods going to and from the Persian Gulf flowed through the Strait of Hormuz. All the trade between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and therefore with the overland routes to Egypt and the Mediterranean, passed through the narrow waters at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. Control these choke points, Albuquerque understood, and you controlled the trade. He pursued this strategy with relentless focus. Goa fell to Portuguese forces in 1510 after 2 attempts. He lost it once, in a disaster that required regrouping and returning, and took it again in what became one of the more violent episodes of Indian Ocean conquest, He killed thousands of the city's Muslim population after its recapture, sparing Hindus and others, but ordering the wholesale slaughter of Muslims in a decision that reflected both his strategic determination to break Muslim commercial dominance of the trade routes and a personal and religious hostility to Islam that ran through everything he did. Goa became the capital of the Estado de India, fortified and garrisoned, and would remain Portuguese for 4.5 centuries. Malacca fell in 1511. The city was one of the richest commercial centres in Asia, a port where, according to contemporaries, 84 languages were spoken in its markets, and merchants from China, India, Java, Arabia, and dozens of other trading cultures converged. Albuquerque seized it with a fleet of 17 ships and about 1,000 European and Indian soldiers, overwhelming the Malay defenders who were less prepared for the ferocity of the Portuguese assault than anyone had quite anticipated. The Muslim merchants who had made Malacca great fled in all directions, to Java, to Sumatra, to ports further east, and would spend the next century trying to rebuild their networks around the Portuguese stranglehold. Their dispersal, paradoxically, spread the influence of Islam more widely across Southeast Asia than the concentrated Muslim presence in Malacca had done. Hormuz, on the Persian Gulf, was taken in 1515. The tiny island of Hormuz was essentially a rock in the sea, its importance entirely strategic, and Albuquerque fortified it with characteristic thoroughness, building the great castle of Our Lady of the Conception whose ruins still exist. With Hormuz, Malacca and Goa in Portuguese hands, supplemented by a string of smaller posts along the African, Indian and Southeast Asian coasts, the Estado de India was essentially complete. The practical operation of this empire was remarkably complex. The Portuguese crown issued cartazes, trade passes, that were required for all ships operating in the Indian Ocean. In theory, any ship that refused to carry a cartaz, or that was found trading without one, was subject to seizure. In practice, the network was never comprehensive enough to enforce this universally. The Indian Ocean was too large, the Portuguese forces too thin, the Asian merchants too numerous and too determined. But it was sufficient to extract enormous revenues and to disrupt the traditional patterns of the spice trade badly enough to change the economics of the market in ways that Portugal could exploit. The daily reality of the Estado de India was far from the gleaming vision of oceanic empire that the cartographers drew in Lisbon. The men who staffed it, the soldiers, the priests, the merchants, the functionaries, lived in a state of perpetual anxiety at the edge of the known world, surrounded by populations that vastly outnumbered them, dependent on supply lines that stretched thousands of miles back to a home they might never see again. Disease was the great equalizer. Malaria, dysentery, cholera, and the nameless fevers of the tropics killed far more Portuguese than any military engagement. Of the men who sailed east in the fleets of the early 16th century, a substantial proportion died before they could return, and those who survived came back changed, darker, thinner, fluent in Swahili or Tamil or Malay, carrying with them some fragment of the world they had lived in that could never be fully translated back into the cobbled streets of Lisbon or Porto. The wives and mothers left behind in Portugal had a name for what they felt during these absences: saudade. The word is notoriously untranslatable. It carries connotations of longing, nostalgia, and a melancholy awareness that what is absent may never return. And it became, over the centuries, a defining feature of Portuguese emotional and cultural life, embedded in the music of fado, in the literature of Luís de Camões, in the particular quality of Portuguese melancholy that seems to remember the world when it was larger and more mysterious. Camões himself sailed east and spent years in India and Macau, writing the epic poem Os Lusíadas, the Lusiads, which celebrated the voyages of Vasco da Gama and turned the Portuguese Age of Discovery into permanent literary form. He lost an eye in a naval battle off the coast of Morocco, nearly drowned in a shipwreck off the Malabar coast, and arrived back in Lisbon in 1570 having written what is now considered the greatest work of Portuguese literature. It was published in 1572 and immediately recognised as an achievement of the first order, the epic of a nation that had sailed to the ends of the earth and was beginning to sense in the long gathering of the poem's final stanzas that the age of its glory might already be past. The profits were real and large, at least in the first half of the 16th century. Spice prices in Lisbon were far below what the overland route had charged, and the Portuguese crown for several decades held something close to a monopoly on the European spice market. But the system had structural vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal. Portugal was too small to staff the Estado da India adequately. The distances were too great for effective oversight from Lisbon. The governors sent east were often corrupt, often incompetent, and always operating with inadequate resources relative to the ambitions of their mandate. The Cartaz system created enemies, hundreds of thousands of Asian and Arab merchants whose livelihoods were disrupted or destroyed, and generated a constant pressure of resistance and circumvention that the Portuguese could slow but never stop. There was also the problem of violence. The Estado da India was maintained by force, and maintaining force required men and ships and money, all of which had to come from somewhere. The revenues from trade were intended to sustain the military apparatus, but the military apparatus consumed resources faster than the trade generated them, and the crown was perpetually in a state of financial stress, borrowing from German and Italian bankers against the security of future spice shipments, and gradually building up debts that would eventually contribute to Portugal's fiscal crisis in the second half of the 16th century. None of this was apparent in the first flush of the Estado da India's success, when ships returning to Lisbon were disgorging cargoes that seemed to embody limitless wealth. What was apparent, even in those early decades, was that the world had fundamentally changed. The Ottoman spice trade through Alexandria was disrupted, though it recovered and continued as a significant competitor to the Portuguese route for most of the 16th century. The Venetians, who had built their entire commercial civilization on the role of middleman between Asia and Europe, faced an existential crisis, and Venice, being Venice, adapted with impressive resilience, but the writing was on the wall. The Indian Ocean world, which had operated for centuries with a rough and pluralistic commercial equilibrium, was now subject to a new kind of power that cared nothing for its traditions and everything for its profits. In the decades between 1498 and 1550, while Albuquerque and his successors were building and maintaining the Estado da India, the Portuguese also pushed further east. Fernão Pires de Andrade arrived in China in 1513, the first European to make official contact with the Ming court, opening a trade relationship that would eventually produce the great Portuguese settlement at Macau. Portuguese merchants reached the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, the source of the nutmeg and cloves that had motivated the entire enterprise, in 1512. In 1543, according to the traditional account, 3 Portuguese merchants aboard a Chinese junk were blown off course and landed on the Japanese island of Tanegashima, beginning European contact with Japan. They brought with them a Portuguese arquebus, a type of firearm, and the Japanese, characteristically, immediately began manufacturing copies of it, with consequences for Japanese internal politics and warfare that would reshape the country over the following century. The global reach of Portuguese trade in the mid-16th century was something that had simply never existed before. A network of commercial connections maintained by force linked Lisbon to West Africa, Brazil, East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. The world was for the first time genuinely integrated in economic terms, not fully, not equitably, not without enormous violence and suffering, but integrated in ways that made it impossible for the events in one corner of the globe not to eventually have consequences in another. And then, into this already crowded and competitive arena, Spain added yet another dimension by seeking a route to the Pacific and the Spice Islands from the west, and found, in doing so, the true shape of the world. Ferdinand Magellan was, in one of the great ironies of the Age of Discovery, Portuguese. Born Fernão de Magalhães sometime around 1480, he had served the Estado da India with distinction, participating in the capture of Malacca in 1511 and the naval battles that established Portuguese dominance over the Spice Islands trade. He had been east of Malacca, possibly as far as the Moluccas, though the evidence for this is not entirely clear. He knew, as well as any European alive, what the eastern approach to the Spice Islands looked like. What he proposed was something else entirely: to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, from Spain, around the southern end of the Americas, if the Americas had a southern end, and across whatever ocean lay beyond. This was, in theory, the route that the Treaty of Tordesillas had assigned to Spain, if only the Spice Islands fell on the Spanish side of the line when it was extended around the other side of the globe. Whether they did fall on the Spanish side was precisely what was unclear, and this uncertainty was, in part, what made Magellan's voyage strategically valuable to Spain and threatening to Portugal. Magellan had fallen out with the Portuguese crown over a relatively minor dispute about pay and recognition, and when his proposals for a western voyage were rejected in Lisbon, he did what Columbus had done a generation earlier. He offered his services to Spain. The Spanish king Charles I, who as Holy Roman Emperor was also Charles V, received him in 1517, and after the usual deliberation and committee examination, agreed to fund the expedition. Portugal lobbied actively against it, understanding immediately what a successful western circumnavigation would mean for the Tordesillas line and the Spice Islands question, and reportedly attempted to have Magellan assassinated. He was protected by Spanish guards and sailed from Seville on September 20th, 1519 with 5 ships and approximately 270 men. The voyage that followed was one of the most harrowing and extraordinary journeys in human history, and it produced a body of eyewitness testimony, particularly in the account of the Italian nobleman Antonio Pigafetta, who sailed the whole way and survived. That reads with the freshness and immediacy of lived experience half a millennium later. Pigafetta wrote with the curiosity and wonder of a man for whom every day brought something unprecedented, and his account of the peoples, lands, animals, and events he encountered is one of the great documents of the Renaissance. The fleet crossed the Atlantic without serious incident, reached the coast of Brazil, the Portuguese side of the line, and then turned south along the coast of South America looking for a passage through to the Western Ocean. There was no certainty that such a passage existed. The coastline of South America as Magellan sailed it in 1520 was mostly unknown to Europeans, and it is possible that no passage existed and that the voyage would have had to be abandoned. But Magellan pressed on, suppressing a mutiny in the bay he named San Julian, with considerable violence, including the execution of one leader and the abandonment of another on the Patagonian coast, and continuing south in conditions of increasing cold and difficulty. In October 1520, he found what he was looking for, a narrow winding passage through the southernmost tip of South America, surrounded by cliffs and glaciers and a bleak landscape that Magellan named Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, for the fires he could see on shore, lit by the indigenous people watching from the land. The passage is now known as the Strait of Magellan, and it took 38 days to navigate. One of the 5 ships, the San Antonio, deserted and sailed back to Spain. The remaining 4 emerged into a vast ocean that was, on the day they reached it, remarkably calm, and which Magellan named the Pacific, the peaceful sea. He did not know how big the Pacific was. No European did. What followed was 98 days of open ocean sailing without sight of land, longer than the entire crossing of the Atlantic, across an expanse of water that covers nearly a third of the globe. The supplies they had brought were consumed. The biscuit ran out, and they ate the crumbs and weevil-infested powder that remained. The water went foul, and they drank it anyway. They ate the leather chafing gear, the ox hides used to protect the rigging, boiling them to soften them enough to chew. Rats were caught and sold among the crew for high prices, because even rats were nutrition. 19 men died of scurvy. Many more were ill. Pigafetta wrote that men's gums swelled so much they could not eat, and that their teeth fell out, and that those who died looked like men who had simply given out, which is exactly what they had done. It is worth pausing here with those men in the Pacific for a moment, because the experience they were having was so far outside any human frame of reference that it defies easy description. They were in a void. The Pacific is not like the Atlantic. It does not have the weed lines and bird signs and colour changes that mark the approach of land, not in the central latitudes where Magellan sailed. Day after day it was simply water to the horizon in every direction. The sky above, the sea below, the ship creaking and rolling in the long Pacific swell, the men growing weaker, the supplies running lower, the sun moving across the sky in its slow arc and telling them nothing useful about how far they still had to go. Some of them must have concluded at some point during those 98 days that they were going to die out here, that the ocean did not have the other side they had been promised, that the whole project of reaching Asia from the west was a fatal error from which there was no return. They were wrong. On March 6th, 1521, they reached the Mariana Islands, 2 small islands, Guam and Rota, which they named the Islands of Thieves after the local people came out in canoes and took what they could from the ships, which seemed to the famished and exhausted Spanish less like hospitality and more like insult. They stopped long enough to take on food and water and to recover some small measure of their strength, and then continued westward to the archipelago that would eventually be named the Philippines. Here Magellan made a decision that killed him. He became involved in a local political dispute, allying with one chief against another, and on April 27, 1521, he waded ashore on the island of Mactan to lead an assault on a chief named Lapu-Lapu who refused to submit to Spain. The assault went badly. Magellan was surrounded in shallow water and killed by Lapu-Lapu's warriors, cut down by bamboo spears and iron blades, in an engagement that he should never have been personally leading. He died not knowing with certainty that he had succeeded. He had sailed far enough west to understand that the Spice Islands were close. He was east of them, but their general location was known from Portuguese charts that he had seen. He knew he had reached the Western Pacific, but the circumnavigation was not yet complete. Command fell eventually to Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque sailor who had been one of the mutiny leaders at San Julian, and who had somehow survived the subsequent proceedings and continued with the fleet. The story of the Victoria's journey from the Philippines back to Spain is almost as harrowing as the Pacific crossing. Elcano loaded the ship with as much cloves as it could carry. Cloves from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands that were the entire commercial justification for the voyage, and chose to return westward through the Indian Ocean, which meant sailing through Portuguese-controlled waters without authorization. He avoided Portuguese ports, rationed water and provisions with strict discipline, and navigated the Cape of Good Hope in winter conditions that very nearly sank his already exhausted ship. When he arrived in Seville on September 6, 1522, 3 years after departure, with 17 surviving crew members out of the original 270, he was greeted as a hero of the First Order. Charles V gave Elcano a coat of arms that showed a globe with the motto Primus circumdedisti me, "You first encircled me." It was a statement of fact and a statement of triumph. The world had been proved to be a sphere not just in theory but in practice, by the bodies of men who had sailed all the way around it. Of the original Armada's 270 men, only 18 completed the circumnavigation on the Victoria, one of whom was Pigafetta, whose account we rely on so heavily. One further group of men reached Spain overland from the east, having made their own separate way home through Asia. The rest were dead or stranded or held prisoner by the Portuguese who had captured one of the ships and its crew. The circumnavigation proved with irrefutable practical evidence that the world was a single connected sphere, that you could go in one direction and keep going, and eventually come back to where you had started. It also proved that the Pacific was vastly larger than anyone had imagined, and this raised immediately the question that the Treaty of Tordesillas had left unresolved. Where did the line fall on the other side of the world? Were the Spice Islands on the Spanish side or the Portuguese side? The answer, which took years of negotiation to settle, and was never resolved to anyone's complete satisfaction, was eventually established by the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, in which Charles V of Spain sold his rights to the Spice Islands to Portugal for 350,000 gold ducats. The money was more immediately useful than the theoretical territorial claim, and Charles was in the perpetual financial crisis that characterized his reign. The Spice Islands were assigned to Portugal. The Philippines, which Spain had reached and named, and which had already attracted Spanish settlers, who were beginning the long project of colonial conquest that would produce 3 centuries of Spanish rule and a lasting Catholic culture in the archipelago, stayed Spanish. The circumnavigation had settled the shape of the world, but not, immediately, the ownership of it. What it had settled, though, was something more fundamental: the end of the age of geographical mystery. After Magellan's voyage, the major outlines of the world's ocean geography were known to Europeans. The Pacific existed and had a western shore. The Americas were separate continents, not Asia. Africa had a southern end. The Indian Ocean was accessible from both east and west. The world's oceans were a single connected system, navigable in principle from any point to any other. The work of the next century would not be to discover the shape of the world, but to fill in its details, to establish which of the known shores held which resources, and to organize the extraction of those resources for European benefit. The age of discovery was becoming the age of exploitation, and the transition was seamless, because the same men, the same institutions, and the same ships that discovered also exploited, without any sense that these were different or contradictory activities. For roughly 60 years after Magellan's voyage, from the 1520s to the 1580s, Portugal and Spain operated as distinct powers with distinct empires, trading rivals bound by treaty, occasionally cooperating on matters of shared Catholic interest but fundamentally in competition. Portugal maintained its Eastern Empire with increasing difficulty. Spain consolidated and expanded its American empire with increasing confidence, discovering and exploiting the silver mines that would make it the wealthiest state in Europe for the better part of a century. Then, in 1578, King Sebastian of Portugal led an army of 20,000 men into Morocco on a crusading expedition that ended in the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, the Battle of the Three Kings, in which Sebastian, two other claimants to the Moroccan throne, and the flower of the Portuguese nobility were killed in a single afternoon. Sebastian had no heirs. The Portuguese succession crisis that followed was resolved, after 2 years of manoeuvring, in favour of Philip II of Spain, who was the most powerful monarch in the world and who had a legitimate claim to the Portuguese crown through his mother. In 1580, Portugal and Spain were united under a single monarch in what is known as the Iberian Union. Philip was careful to promise, and initially to deliver, that the two empires would remain legally and administratively separate, that the Portuguese trading routes would remain under Portuguese administration and protected by Portuguese law, that Portuguese would not be governed by Spaniards. For a generation, the union was managed with something approaching tact, and the question of whether Portugal had been absorbed by Spain or merely linked to it remained genuinely open. But the Iberian Union had consequences that no treaty could prevent. By uniting the two crowns, it made Portugal a belligerent in Spain's wars, most importantly the growing conflict with the Protestant maritime powers of northern Europe. England and the Dutch Republic, which was fighting Spain for its independence, both had reasons to attack Portuguese shipping and Portuguese possessions, and in the logic of war they did not need to distinguish between the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Portuguese ships and colonies were legitimate targets in a war against Spain, regardless of the legal niceties of the Union. The decisive moment came in 1588, when Philip's armada, the great fleet intended to invade England, was destroyed by a combination of English resistance and catastrophic weather. The defeat did not end Spanish power, but it emboldened the English and the Dutch, and demonstrated that the Iberian monopoly on oceanic power was not eternal. In the years after 1588, Dutch and English ships began appearing in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in waters that Portugal and Spain had considered their exclusive preserve. They came as traders, and as pirates, and eventually as colonizers, and they brought with them the commercial innovation of the Joint Stock Company, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, which mobilized private capital at a scale that no single royal treasury could match. The Portuguese Estado da India was not defeated in a single battle or a single year. It eroded slowly as the Dutch seized key fortifications, disrupted supply lines, and established competing trading relationships with the Asian rulers who had always resented Portuguese monopoly control. Malacca fell to the Dutch in 1641. The spice trade was rerouted through Dutch facilities. The Cartas system, which had always been partially a fiction, became entirely so as Dutch naval power made Portuguese enforcement of it impossible. Spain's American empire was more durable, protected by the Atlantic crossing that made it harder for northern European rivals to reach, and by the sheer scale of the settlement that had been established. But the flow of silver from Potosí began to decline in the early 17th century as the most accessible ore was exhausted and the labour force, decimated by disease and the brutal conditions of the mines, contracted. The Spanish crown, which had borrowed heavily against the silver income, repeatedly went bankrupt in 1557, 1575, 1596, and several more times in the 17th century. The economic logic of empire was not as simple as it had seemed when the first galleons returned from the Americas laden with Aztec gold. The two empires did not collapse suddenly. They contracted, consolidated, lost their monopolies, and eventually evolved into colonial systems that lasted, in some cases, into the 20th century. Brazil remained Portuguese until 1822. The Philippines remained Spanish until 1898. Portugal maintained its African territories until the 1970s. The longevity of these later colonial relationships is a measure of how deeply the Iberian empires had embedded themselves in the territories they controlled and how completely they had remade those territories in the process. The unravelling, when it came, was gradual and uneven. In Asia, the Portuguese Estado de India persisted as a shadow of itself for long after its commercial dominance had ended. Portuguese priests, merchants and soldiers remained in Goa and Macau and Malacca, long after Dutch and English competition had made the Cartaz system unenforceable and the spice monopoly a memory. The Portuguese language sank roots into coastal Asia that proved surprisingly durable, not in its Lisbon form, but in the creolized pidgins that formed wherever Portuguese traders and local populations lived in sustained contact, and which for 2 centuries served as the lingua franca of Asian trade from the Persian Gulf to Nagasaki. These contact languages are called Portuguese creoles, and some of them survive today in isolated communities in Sri Lanka, India, Malacca and elsewhere. Linguistic fossils of the age when Portugal was the dominant power in the Indian Ocean. In the Americas, the Spanish Empire was replaced not by external conquest but by internal revolution. The independence movements of the early 19th century were largely led by criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas, who had absorbed the liberal political ideas of the Enlightenment and resented the administrative and commercial restrictions that Madrid imposed on the colonies. Between 1810 and 1826, most of Spanish America achieved independence in a series of wars and political transformations whose immediate causes were various but whose underlying logic was the same. The colonial relationship had outlived its political and economic usefulness, and the people who ran the colonial economy on the ground saw no reason to continue sharing its profits with a crown that was by then militarily weakened and politically unstable. But the age in which Portugal and Spain truly ruled the oceans, when they were the dominant naval and commercial powers of the globe, when the line drawn at Tordesillas was a genuine geopolitical reality rather than a historical curiosity. That age lasted roughly from the fall of Ceuta in 1415 to the defeat of the Armada in 1588, and within that span, from roughly 1490 to 1580, they exercised a degree of oceanic dominance that no single civilizational bloc had achieved before, and that would not be matched again until Britain's 19th century. The world they made in that 90 years has never been unmade. It persists, in every sense that matters, in the world we inhabit today. Stand on the western coast of Brazil and look out to sea, and the ocean you are looking at is the Atlantic, the ocean that Portugal crossed. The language you would hear behind you is Portuguese. The religion practiced in the great Baroque churches of Salvador and Recife and Olinda is the Roman Catholic faith that the Portuguese brought with them, and the food, the rice and beans, the salt cod imported from the North Atlantic, the pastéis and pão de queijo that are the daily bread of Brazilian life, carries in its ingredients and its techniques the imprint of 3 continents blended over 5 centuries. Brazil is the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world, with more than 200 million inhabitants, far more than Portugal itself, and it is a living monument to what the Portuguese age of discovery set in motion. The country's very DNA reflects the brutal arithmetic of the colonial period. Indigenous genes, African genes, and European genes combined in ratios that tell the story of conquest, enslavement, and the long human consequences of decisions made by men on ships in the 15th and 16th centuries. Walk through the streets of Goa, in India, and the Portuguese presence announces itself in the white-plastered churches that face the palm-fringed harbour, in the family names of the old Catholic community, in the particular character of Goan cooking where chili and coconut milk and vinegar combine in ways that reflect a culinary conversation between the Malabar coast and the Iberian Peninsula conducted across 5 centuries. The Basilica of Bomhedas in Old Goa, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contains the body of Francis Xavier, the Spanish Jesuit missionary who arrived in Goa in 1542 and spent the rest of his short life travelling through Asia from India to Japan, trying to establish Christianity in the most distant parts of the Portuguese trading empire. His body, which has never decomposed in the normal manner, is displayed in a silver reliquary and visited by pilgrims of multiple faiths, a strange and touching testimony to the way the age of discovery entangled religious mission with commercial expansion in ways that neither the missionaries nor the merchants could fully disentangle. Macau, on the coast of China, returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1999, but preserves in its old town a Portuguese architectural vocabulary that sits in extraordinary juxtaposition with the casino towers and container ships that surround it. The language of Tetum, spoken in East Timor, carries Portuguese words that have been there for 400 years. The Cape Verdean Creole, spoken on the islands off the coast of West Africa that Portugal settled in the mid-15th century, and which became a major node in the Atlantic slave trade, is a Portuguese-based language that reflects the particular human mixture of those islands, European settlers, enslaved Africans from the mainland, and their descendants, in every one of its grammatical structures. The music of Cape Verde, particularly the saudade-infused morna that Cesária Évora carried to world audiences in the 1990s, speaks in tones that echo across 5 centuries of Atlantic history. The Spanish legacy is equally pervasive, and in terms of sheer geographical extent, perhaps more so. The Spanish language is spoken as a first language by more than 500 million people across 19 countries, making it the second most spoken language in the world by native speakers, and the second most spoken language in the United States, where the consequences of the Spanish colonial period in Mexico and Central America continue to shape demography and culture in ways that American political life is still somewhat anxiously absorbing. The Catholic Church, in its specifically Spanish colonial form, Baroque architecture, the santos and retablos and elaborate devotional traditions that came out of the encounter between Iberian Catholicism and indigenous American religious life, is the dominant religious tradition across Latin America and among the Latino communities of the United States. The silver of Potosí paid for the 30 Years' War in Europe, funded the Spanish art of the Golden Age that produced Velázquez and Cervantes, capitalized the trade that brought Chinese silk and porcelain to European tables, and created the first genuinely global currency, the Spanish piece of 8, the Real de a Ocho, that circulated from Manila to Seville to London to Canton and back again. The modern global economy, with its emphasis on silver-backed currency, its intercontinental trade networks, its colonial plantation agriculture, traces its origins directly to the century that Portugal and Spain spent building the infrastructure of oceanic empire. The legacies are not only material. The encounter between the Old World and the New produced what Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange, the global redistribution of plants, animals and diseases that was set in motion by the voyages of the 1490s and that changed human life on every continent. Maize and potatoes, both of them American crops introduced to Europe and beyond through the Spanish colonies, became staple foods across Eurasia and Africa, supporting population growth that would not otherwise have been possible. It is not an exaggeration to say that the potato fed the Irish, the Northern English, the Prussians, and large parts of Russia through the 18th and 19th centuries, and that without it the population growth that fueled the Industrial Revolution would have been impossible. The tomato, which originated in the Americas, is now the foundation of Italian and Spanish and Greek and Turkish cuisine, cuisines that existed for millennia without it, and that cannot now be imagined without it. Chocolate, once a luxury drink of the Aztec elite, is now the single most widely consumed sweet flavouring on Earth. In the other direction, wheat and rice, horses and cattle, smallpox and measles moved into the Americas and transformed them with equal thoroughness, if with infinitely more tragic consequences for the people who were already there. The horse, which had evolved in the Americas millions of years ago and then become extinct there, was reintroduced by the Spanish, and within a century had been adopted by the Great Plains peoples of North America, the Comanche, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and had given them a way of life and a military capability that transformed the history of the continent. The paradox of the horse's return is one of the stranger wrinkles in the story. The same colonial project that brought smallpox also restored the horse, and the horse gave the indigenous peoples of the plains decades more of resistance and cultural vitality than they might otherwise have had. The question we started with, who ruled the oceans first, resolves, on examination, into something more complex and more interesting than a simple answer can contain. Portugal ruled first in time, the first to move systematically into oceanic exploration, and the first to establish a genuinely global trading empire. Spain ruled first in territorial scale, building in the Americas the largest land empire that the Western world had yet seen. Portugal pioneered the eastern route, Spain opened the Western Hemisphere. Portugal built the template for commercial maritime empire, Spain built the template for territorial colonial empire. Both templates were taken up and modified and extended by the powers that came after them, the Dutch, the English, the French, and the world those powers built is, in the most fundamental sense, the world we still live in. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, because it is easy to let history become abstract, to let the numbers, the millions of enslaved people, the millions of indigenous dead, the billions of coins, float. free of the specific human beings who lived and died within them. Behind every piece of data in this story is a person. The Taino man who came to the beach on October the 12th, 1492, to look at Columbus's ships, curious and unafraid, not yet knowing what his curiosity was going to cost him. The African woman separated from her children at the slave market in Lagos in 1444, whom the chronicler Zurara noticed and described with evident discomfort, and then recorded without mercy. The Aztec warrior who fought Cortes, and whose name we do not know. The Portuguese sailor who died of scurvy in mid-Atlantic without ever knowing whether his ship was going to make it to India. The young Inca herder who saw horses for the first time and could not yet imagine what they would come to mean. History is made of people like these, most of whose names are gone, whose only monument is the world that their lives and deaths, their courage and suffering helped to build. There is one more thread worth following before the story fully rests. In the city of Lisbon today, if you take the train along the Tagus to the district of Belém and walk down to the waterfront, you will find the monument to the discoveries, a great angular structure built in 1960 on the 500th anniversary of Henry the Navigator's death, shaped like the prow of a caravel cutting into the river, with Henry himself at the front and dozens of navigators, cartographers, missionaries and poets ranked behind him in stone. Vasco da Gama is there, and Bartolomeu Dias, and Fernão de Magalhães, Magellan, who sailed for Spain but was born Portuguese, and whose figure in the monument holds a globe. Camões is there with his epic poem. So are the cartographers and the priests and the kings who funded it all. What is not there, what could not, in 1960, be represented in a monument celebrating national achievement, are the enslaved Africans whose labour built the Atlantic economy that funded the exploration, the Taino people who watched Columbus come ashore, the millions of indigenous Americans who died in the epidemics and the mines, the Indian merchants whose trade routes were seized. They are the absent figures in the stone, the people without whom the monument would be impossible and who are not in it. A fully honest monument would need to be much more complicated than stone and concrete can make it, because the history it commemorates is more complicated than celebration can contain. This is not a reason to refuse the history or to bury it. It is a reason to hold it fully, to let its dimensions be as large as they actually are, to understand that the same voyages that connected the world for the first time also cause suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to fully measure. The caravels that went out from the Tagus were carrying everything, the courage and the greed, the curiosity and the violence, the faith and the calculation, all of it at once, inseparable, the way that history always carries everything at once and never asks our permission to be complicated. That is who ruled the oceans first, not a country, not a crown, a decision, a willingness to go. And now, wherever you are, in whatever quiet room or darkness you have made for yourself tonight, that is where the story rests, in you, in the unbroken thread of consequence that runs from those caravels on the Tagus to this moment. The world that Portugal and Spain made is the world you live in ways you may never finish discovering, and now, after all that crossing, all that distance, all those centuries, it is time to rest. Let the ocean carry you. Let the night take you. You have travelled far enough for one evening, from the warehouses of Ceuta to the harbours of Calicut, from the shores of Hispaniola to the Silver Mountain in the Andes, from the storm-lashed waters of the Cape of Good Hope to the vast and terrifying quiet of the Pacific. And the story will be here in the morning, as it has been for 500 years, patient as the sea.